Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today for part 9 of the Summer-Ween Halloween DIY series, I thought it would be fun to take a look at some of my favorite DIYs from last year. For this first project, you're going to grab one of these plastic skulls from Dollar Tree, and I started by giving it just one coat of my black chalk paint. Then I kind of wanted to do a romantic twist on this skull, so I grabbed these air dry clay molds that I got from Amazon with some of my air dry clay, and I just started kind of pressing out random flowers and the parts of the leaves. Once I had a few of these made, then I figured out where I wanted to place these on the skull. Now, one thing I will say is that you need to kind of make sure that the weight is the same because these clay pieces are a little bit heavy, so making sure that the weight difference is the same on both sides will prevent this from falling over. Or if you wanted to, you could definitely put a hole in the bottom of this skull, maybe add some rocks or rice or something heavy to help hold this up. Then after I glued all my pieces down to the skull, I went back in and did another coat of my black chalk paint over the clay pieces and also a second coat over the skull. Then finally, to bring out all those beautiful details on these floral molds, I went back in with some of my European Gold Rub and Buff and a little brush, and I just brushed over the clay pieces. For this project, I'm just grabbing another thrifted frame. This one, however, didn't have a backing, so I just cut down one from some Dollar Tree foam board. I'm also going to be using 2 of these Dollar Tree skulls, and as you can see here, for the first one, I just cut off the back side of it, and then for this second one, I split that right down the center. Then I'm going to leave the frame over that poster board for now and kind of arrange and cut down the skulls to the size that I need for them to actually fit down in this frame. Once they were all the right size and everything, then I just used some hot glue to attach them to that foam board. Again, just leaving the frame on here so that I can make sure everything fits nicely. Then I'll just set that frame aside now, and I'm going to take some more of this Dollar Tree tissue paper with some Mod Podge, and I'm going to start working in small sections. I'm going to do the top half first, and then I will put this tissue paper over top of there, just kind of pressing it down, and then use my brush with the leftover Mod Podge, really push this down and get all the details of the skull. And again, just like with the potion bottle, this is another project where you don't have to worry about the wrinkles or creases because you're trying to get that creepy texture on here. So like I said, I'm just working in sections, and once I had that top piece done, then I moved on to that center skull, doing the exact same thing, just Mod Podging it down and then using that brush with the leftover Mod Podge to go back over the skull and everything. And as you may have noticed, this did tear a little bit in some places, but it's completely fine. Once this is dry, I'm actually just going to go back over anywhere where the tissue paper tore or split into, and I'll just add little pieces back over those spots. And once I have everything covered again, then I will set this aside and let it completely dry. Then I just went in with some scissors and cut off all of that excess paper. Now, I did take this outside and spray paint it for the first coat just because I found it a lot easier to spray paint this first. But then for the second layer, I'm going in with some of my white chalk paint and just covering it again. Then moving back to the frame, I did want to dress this up a little bit. It was just a little too plain. So I wanted to add this little decorative piece to the top of the frame. So I'm using one of my Amazon molds and some air dry clay. And I just did that little top piece, and then I took this outside and spray painted it gold. Then I came back in and used some of my Rub and Buff just to give that gold some more depth. For this project, I wanted to make a papier-mâché witch hat, so I am just using some Dollar Tree packing paper for this. I'm also just going to be using my cone I have here that I always reuse for things. And I'm just going to use that to kind of shape a piece of that packing paper. And then I'm going to use masking tape to tape that shape. Then I will just remove it from that cone, and I'm going to start twisting the top part of it so that I can get that little wispy part of the witch hat. Once I have the shape that I wanted, then I'm just going to stuff this with some plastic bags. You can use extra paper or stuffing if you want to. This is going to be removed later, but for now, I'm just using it to keep the shape. Then I'm going to use some more masking tape, and I'm just going to mask this entire thing, front and back and all the sides, the top, everything, how I want it shaped with this masking tape. And this is just to make it more sturdy. Then I'm going to grab my glue mixture. This is just a mixture of white school glue, a little bit of water, 2 tablespoons of flour, and a teaspoon of salt to help prevent mold. Then I cut down some Dollar Tree packing paper into strips. Now you can definitely just use newspaper or some recycled paper you have, but I already had this on hand, and so I just cut down some strips, and I'm going to start dipping them into that glue mixture and then squeezing them out with my fingers before putting them onto my witch's hat. Now, when I did get to the top, I had to split those pieces in half and make them a little smaller just so that this would lay nicely at the top part of the hat. Once I had the entire thing covered, then I just sat this outside in the sun for a few hours to let it completely dry. Then I brought it back in and removed all those plastic bags from the center. For the bottom part of the hat, I just cut out a piece of cardboard, and I'm going to use some hot glue to attach the top piece to that bottom piece of cardboard. Then I'm kind of just going to do the exact same thing. I am going to go around with some more of that masking tape, and I'm putting it up on the top piece and then bringing it down over the bottom piece and wrapping it underneath that cardboard piece. Then I'm going to go back in with a little more masking tape and tape it around that bottom part. Then I can go in and start doing my second layer of paper mache, starting at the bottom and again pushing the top part of it onto the top piece of the hat and then pushing it over the bottom part. Once I have those vertical pieces done and the bottom part all covered, then I'll just continue wrapping my paper mache pieces around the witch hat again, just like I did the first layer. And once that second layer was complete, I just sat this back outside in the sun to dry for a few hours. For the third and final layer, I am just cutting down some Dollar Tree napkins. It doesn't have to be expensive napkins, and actually the cheaper the better, because you're going to get those nice wrinkles like a cloth witch's hat would have. But I'm just doing the exact same thing, dipping these down into that glue mixture and covering this entire thing. And then for this layer, I ended up letting this dry fully for 2 days just to make sure everything was nice and dry before I painted it. Then I just used my black chalk paint and went over this entire thing with 2 coats. To bring out a lot of those details and those wrinkles, I went back in with some of my European Gold Rub and Buff and just brushed over this entire thing. To dress it up, I grabbed some of my gold velvet ribbon and I just tied a little bow around the bottom part. Then I wanted to add a little hanging spider from the hat, so I'm using some of this gold floral wire from Dollar Tree and this little hanging spider that I got off of Amazon. It actually already had a little hook piece on the bottom, so I was able to wrap that floral wire around that piece, and then I used a sharp little pointy thing to make a little hole at the end of the witch's hat and then just insert it into that hole. This next project is super easy if you don't want to take the time to actually make a spooky ghost mirror. Then you can print off this free template from Martha Stewart. I'll have it linked below in my description, but I just had mine printed off at Walgreens on a poster board, so it's a little thicker and I can work with it to make this even more spooky and to make it look even more like a mirror. If you click the link in the description below to go to the Martha Stewart website, you'll also see she's going to do this tutorial a little bit different than I am. I'm just doing this as easy as possible to make this look like a spooky mirror. Now, unfortunately, I didn't have any metallic silver paint on hand. If you've been here a while, you know I love gold, so I had tons of the folk art metallic gold paint, and I just ended up mixing some of that with some gray paint to make my own shiny silver paint. But definitely, if you have metallic silver paint, that would work best for this project. So after I mixed up my gold metallic paint with some gray paint, then I'm gonna wet down a piece of sponge. Any sponge will work. This is just one I had on hand. So just make sure that your sponge is nice and wet, not dripping, but wet enough that the paint is gonna stay wet the entire time that you're doing this. And I'm just gonna dip my sponge down in the paint, and then as you can see, I'm blotting the majority of the paint back off of my sponge before I go in, and I am barely touching this poster board as I'm doing this, but I am just tapping that sponge all over this poster. I'm just going to continue working this sponge and that little tiny bit of paint all over this poster until I was quite happy with the results of it. Now, like I said, I'm going in very lightly at first, but I do go back in after this first coat dries, and then I can make it a little bit thicker without overdoing it. Also, as you can see, I do go over the hands on here with this paint as well. But again, when I'm doing that, it's just very light coats. And I'm going to end up concentrating the most paint on the edges of this. Now, once I have this entire poster board covered with that paint, then I'm just going to take my sponge and really barely touching this again, just go back and forth and up and down with that sponge to kind of smear in the paint. And then you can just keep sponging on and wiping back and forth and up and down until you're happy with the way it looks. Now, once I was finished, I grabbed a thrift store frame that would fit this, took it outside along with this poster board, and I spray painted my frame gold. And then on this poster board, I just wanted to add a little bit of gold to it. So I ended up spritzing it and kind of letting the gold spray paint drip a little bit onto this poster template. And finally, once everything was dry, all I had to do was add this to my frame. For this final project, I grabbed one of these little shadow box frames that I got from the thrift store, and I started by taking this frame apart, and then I painted both of these little frames with some of my black chalk paint. Once they were dry, I stacked them back together just so I could see where the details would show on these frames, and I used some of my European Gold Rub and Buff, went over a lot of the details and some of that inner frame. Now, I ended up using the backing piece that was in the frame for this project, and here I am covering it up with some of my velvet adhesive paper, but this is going to get messy. I do end up having to recover it, so I recommend not covering this until after we do the clay part. So the idea for this was to have a ghost looking like he was coming out of this frame. Since it was a shadow box frame, I figured this would be perfect for it. So I grabbed some of my air dry clay and I started rolling it out. You're gonna need kind of a larger piece for this, and you wanna make it as thin as possible, but not too thin that it's gonna tear. So really, depending on the size of your frame will depend on the piece that you'll need. Once I had my piece rolled out, then I grabbed one of these little foam balls from Dollar Tree, and I'm gonna place it right in the center of my rolled out piece of clay because I wanted this ghost to look 3D. And here you see I'm placing a dowel into that foam ball, but that's just to hold this up while I'm working my way around this and making the little pleats in the ghost sheet. If you needed to make this easier for you, you could put that dowel into another piece of foam to hold it up, but it was easy enough to just kind of twirl this around and work with the clay to make those pleats. And once I was happy with how the ghost looked, then this is where my back piece kind of started to get messy because I needed to use a little bit of water on my finger to smooth out any of the little cracks or anything in my ghost. And also, you may notice right here, I decided my ghost wasn't long enough. I wanted that back piece to go down into the frame so it looked more like he was coming out of it. So here I'm just taking some really thin pieces of clay, adding those to the backside, and then this is where, of course, it started to get messy. So I am just using some of that water on my finger, smoothing out any wrinkles or cracks or anywhere where you could see my finger marks in the clay. So just continue doing that until everything is nice and smooth. But as you can see, I wanted his head on the outside of the frame, his arms on the outside, and then that back piece to still kind of be in the frame. And of course, since I had to extend the back side of the ghost, I wanted to extend the front a little bit so it didn't look so awkward. And so then I just added some more thin pieces of clay to the front, and again just blending that in with my finger and some of the water. Once I was happy with how the ghost looked, then I just carefully picked him up from the frame, laid him onto a Dollar Tree cutting mat so that I could let that dry overnight. Then the next day, I did go ahead and recover that backing piece with another piece of velvet and position my ghost in the frame where I wanted him. Now you see here, I did end up having to tape the back of the bottom piece of the frame since I tucked the bottom part of the ghost down in there. But once I was happy with the positioning, then I just used some gel super glue to attach this in the frame and added some eyes with my black paint pen. For this next project, I grabbed one of these little pumpkin jars from Dollar Tree last year, and I also grabbed my dry erase marker and I just drew a spider web on here. The reason I used a dry erase marker was, as you can see, I made a few mistakes and you can just easily wipe it off if you do. Once I had it drawn on there, then I'm going to grab my hot glue gun and I'm very carefully going to try to go over these lines and keep them as straight as possible. But it is a spider web, so it's okay if it's a little wiggly. If you do have any strands or mistakes on here, you can just peel those off whenever it is completely dry. You'll definitely want to let that completely dry and cool down, and then I went in with 2 coats of my black chalk paint over this entire thing, and I just kind of dabbed it down into where that hot glue spider web was so that I could get the paint down in there. To finish this little vase jar off, I'm actually just using this little sponge tool that came with my rub and buff from Amazon, and I am just carefully going over that spider web and trying not to get it on any of the jar. The only part of the jar I used it on was just tipping the top of it. For this final project, I grabbed a thrift store book. You can use a Dollar Tree book or a book you already have for this project. You'll also need a piece of glass. I'm just using an 8x10 piece out of a picture frame. And then I also just hand drew a spine and some ribs. You can, of course, trace this out if you need to. I'm just going to start by laying that piece of glass over my spine and my ribs. And then I'm going to take my hot glue gun and I'm carefully gonna trace out over top of this onto the glass. Once I have the entire thing done, then I'm gonna go back in and fill all the rib pieces in with some hot glue. You don't have to worry about filling in the spine part, but I do recommend using a cheaper or maybe Dollar Tree hot glue sticks for this because you do use quite a few. Now you'll wanna let this completely dry and cool down, and then you should be able to just peel this up from the glass. It is a little sticky and a little tricky to do, and I did end up breaking a few pieces of my hot glue on my spine, but don't worry about it because you can always just glue those back down when we put this on the book. But once I had it all peeled up, then I am going to line this up on my book, making sure that the skeleton spine is lined up with the spine of my book. And then I'm going to start by hot gluing the bottom piece of the spine and the top piece of the spine, just so that I can keep it where I want it as I start gluing down the rib pieces for the skeleton. And as I'm gluing those rib pieces, then I'm going to go back and glue those broken spine pieces to the spine of the book as I'm working my way down. Then I just repeated gluing that down to the front side of the book. And I am just using hot glue to glue all this down to the book because hot glue sticks to hot glue the best. But once I had it all glued down, then I just kind of went back in, and any little holes that I saw, I filled those in with my hot glue. Then I wanted to add some vertebrae to the spine of this, so I went back over those first lines with a little bit of hot glue, and then I'm just going to make a straight line all the way from the bottom of the book to the top of the book to make those vertebrae. Then I'm going to cover this book to make it extra textured and creepy and also blend in that skeleton to this book. I'm using some tacky glue. You can use Mod Podge if you want to, but I find that the tacky glue gives a lot more texture. It's a little thicker. You can also work with it for a little longer because it takes longer to dry, and I found it helps so that my napkin is not going to rip when I put it on here. I did use a paintbrush to kind of dab it in between those ribs. Then, like I said, I'm going to just add one layer of a napkin onto here, kind of stretch it out, and then I will start pushing it down in between those ribs to start with. Then I'm just going to push it down all over my book, and you can see there's definitely wrinkles, there's definitely texture, and that's what we want for this book. But as you're pressing this napkin down on here, just make sure that you are definitely pushing it down in between all those ribs and around the outside of the ribs as well. Then I moved on to the spine of the book, and again, I'm using that tacky glue, and I just put a little bit in between where we made those vertebrae, and then I'm gonna pull my napkin over the book, and again, just pressing down, making sure I'm getting this napkin down into all that detail. Then because I didn't have enough napkin to go over the other side of my book, I just kind of trimmed off a lot of the excess on there, and I'm gonna go in with some tacky glue, push that down onto my book, and then I'll grab another piece of napkin and do the same exact thing. I let the book completely dry, and then I went back in and just kind of trimmed off most of the excess. I did leave a little bit hanging off, and I am going to go in with some Mod Podge now and just add some Mod Podge to the inside of the book and press this napkin up inside of there to make all the edges and ends of the book nice and neat. Then I set it aside to let it completely dry. To embellish my book a little bit more, I grabbed this little keyhole clay mold that I got from Amazon with some of my air dry clay and just made a little keyhole to go on my book. I used some gel super glue to attach it to the front, and then I'm going to go in and do 2 coats of my black chalk paint all over this book. Once that was dry, to finish this off, of course, I'm going in with some of my rub and buff, and I did my little keyhole and all of the spine and the ribs. And then with what was left over on my brush, I just kind of brushed it all over my book. For this project, I ended up grabbing this long rectangular frame from my thrift store. It didn't have a backing, so I just ended up cutting out a piece of cardboard from one of my packages and fit it to the frame. And then I'm going to paint this with 2 coats of my Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster. Then I went into Photoshop and created this little sign from the Raven, and this is also available on my blog for you. If you are interested, I will leave the link in the description box below. But once I had this created, then I'm taking just a piece of Dollar Tree's packing paper, which I was able to cut it in the length that I needed, and I copied this from my computer, just tracing over it onto this paper. Then as you can see, I'm taking some of my carbon paper, which I got from Amazon, and I'm going to tape it down to that piece that I'm using as the backing. Then I just taped my sign down onto the carbon paper so it's not moving around as I'm doing this. Then just using my little tool that also came with my carbon paper, I'm just going to trace over this entire thing. And then once I pulled that off, I was able to just use my paint marker and go over all those words, and also I traced around my Raven. Now initially I didn't want to waste my paint marker coloring in the little spaces that needed to be darkened on the Raven piece, but they were so tiny that I wasn't able to really use a paintbrush for this, so I did end up having to color this in with my paint marker. Now as for the frame itself, I was a little bit torn whether I should paint this frame or not, but I do like a good dark wood frame, so what I ended up deciding was just to use these little bronze corner pieces instead. For this project, I'm grabbing a large ball of my air dry clay and I am just going to knead that in my hands a little bit, warm it up and get it ready to shape. Then I'm going to just start rolling this around on one of Dollar Tree's little cutting mats and I'm going to start shaping this into a ghost shape. Once I had it all rolled out and to the size that I wanted, then I'm just going to kind of pinch around where his neck would be to make an indentation between his head and his neck. And then I'm also going to shape the very tip top where it's a little thinner and kind of just lean that over to the side. And when I was happy with it, this is what the shape ended up looking like. Now I want this ghost to be able to hold something, so I'm going to make him a couple little arms just using some more of that air dry clay. I grabbed 2 small pieces and I'm going to start rolling those out and sizing them up. At first they were a little too big, so I just pinched off some of the clay and just kept working with it until I was happy with both of the arms. Now, instead of gluing his arms to him, I'm actually going to be doing some clay slipping on this ghost. And what I did was just rough up the little spot where I'm going to put his arm. And then I'm just using a paintbrush and some water to attach his arm to his body. And then I'm going to go back in with a little more water, get that nice and wet. And then I'm going to take a really thin, tiny piece of clay and I dipped it into the water. And then I'm just going to use my finger with some water on it and I'm going to rub that in to blend his arm into his body. So you'll see I just keep dipping my finger in the water and rubbing it over his arm right where his shoulder would be to blend both of those pieces of clay together so it looks like this is just one single piece. And using this method, you won't have to worry that his arm is going to fall off or anything like that because wet clay is actually kind of like a glue to itself, so this is going to work nicely just to make this piece look like it was just made in one piece. Once I was finished with the first arm, then I just went to the other side and I did the exact same process. Again, just scraping up his body a little bit, adding some water, then attaching his arm, and again, taking some small thin pieces of clay, dipping those in the water, then blending it all in with my finger. And if you're not able to get it all completely smooth, don't worry about it because once this is completely dry, you can sand this down a little bit to blend it even further. Now, like I said, I wanted this ghost to be holding something, and that something is a pumpkin. So I'm actually using this little pumpkin mold that I got from Amazon, and it's actually 2 pieces that go together, but I'm only going to be using the one piece to make half of the pumpkin. Now, I'm not going to attach this to my ghost just yet because I want my ghost to completely dry, and then here it is the next day. It is pretty much completely dry, and like I said before, I did sand this down a little bit, then just wipe it off with a paper towel, and now I'm going in with some of my white chalk paint first, and then for the pumpkin, I mixed up some burnt orange paint, and I'm going to do 2 coats on there, and I also painted the stem with some brown paint before attaching this to the front of my ghost just using some gel super glue. And finally, all I had to do was use my little paint marker here to make his little eyes and his mouth. For this final project, I really wanted to make a ghost planner. I saw one on Pinterest last year and I just decided this year I was going to make one. So I grabbed this little ceramic pot that I already had. You can use any planter or even a plastic container, whatever you have on hand. So I'm actually going to be doing a papier-mâché ghost for this. So here I have some water mixed with a tiny bit of flour, some regular white school glue, and I added a tablespoon of salt to keep this from molding. Now I didn't really measure anything I put in here, but you're going to want this to be a super thin pancake batter consistency. And you don't need a ton of flour for this. I think I put maybe a tablespoon or two in here, but once you get it all in, just keep mixing it up until you get that consistency. For the paper I'm using for this, you could definitely use recycle paper, but I didn't have enough laying around, so I ended up using some Dollar Tree packing paper and just cut that down into strips. Now here you're also going to see me rolling some of those longer pieces, and I'm actually using these to make the indentions of the ghost sheet. I don't know what they're called, but you'll see in just a little bit. So once I get that paper rolled down, then I'm dipping it down into my mixture and I'm kind of pinching the top of it. And then I'm going to start attaching these to my ceramic planner. Now, as you're doing this, don't worry if these do not totally stick to the planner. You just want to get them in place and you want them to be very moistened with that glue mixture. So you'll see I just keep working my way around the planner, adding more of those, and then I'm going to take some of those little sheets that I had cut down, dip those down into my mixture, and you can see I'm actually taking my fingers and rubbing off a lot of the excess, and then I'm going to put these over top of those rolled up pieces that I made and push them tight to attach them to the planner. So essentially I'm just taking those strips, dipping them, wringing them out a little bit with my fingers, and then covering up these rolled up pieces to encase them tight to the planner. You can also see that at the top I'm actually pushing these over the edge of the planner to the inside. And at this stage, you don't need to worry about if it's pretty or not. You just want to cover everything. So once I had that first side done, this is what it ended up looking like. You can see it is not perfect, but that's okay. I moved on to the other side and I just repeated the same process. Once I was finished, I actually sat this outside in the sun for a few hours to dry, which actually worked really wonderfully because this was, like I said, completely dry just after a few hours. So then I was able to move on to the second layer and I just repeated that whole process over again of covering this entire thing with another layer of those paper strips in my glue mixture. Then again, I sat this outside in the sunlight to dry. Now, as you may have noticed when I did the second layer, the bottom was very uneven. So once this was dry from the second layer, I brought it back in and I trimmed off that bottom. And then I'm taking some smaller strips and folding those over the bottom to make it nice and neat, just dipping those smaller pieces into the glue mixture and putting them over the bottom parts of this. Then it was time for the final layer of this, and this is what's going to make it look a lot neater and less noticeable where you have the paper strips. I'm actually just taking some pieces of paper towel, cutting that down into strips, dipping it down into my mixture, and then for this third and final layer, I'm just covering this entire thing with those paper towel strips. And again, just like before, I actually let this dry in the sun, this time for 2 days, just to make sure everything was really nice and dry before I went in with a baking soda and white chalk paint mixture. And I went over this entire thing with 2 coats of that mixture. Once that was dry, then I just wanted to go in and add a little variation of color, kind of like the inspiration. So I'm just taking this tan paint and I have a wet paintbrush. I'm kind of just going over certain spots and then I'm rubbing it in with my finger. And then I also took a little bit of black paint on my brush and I'm kind of, again, just tapping that in random spaces, just like the inspiration. Now for the eyes, you can just hand draw these if you wanted to, but since this is kind of an awkward shape and I'm not that great at drawing eyes, I'm actually just using this oval stencil that I got from Amazon, and I do end up changing it to the thinner oval eyes. But once I have those traced on there, then I'm just using some black chalk paint to fill those all in. For this project, I'm going to be using this little birchwood piece that I got from Dollar Tree last year, and then also one of these large birch rounds that I got off of Amazon to make some little ghosty paintings. Starting with the long, thin one that I got from Dollar Tree, here I'm just kind of drawing out a ghost with my pencil. That way, if there's any details I didn't like, I could just change them. Then I'm going to start by painting the background first before I paint the ghost, and I'm just using some black chalk paint to fill in most of that background. I left some of the wood showing and also left that bottom piece. Now you can also see here when I was drawing with my pencil, I did some little shadow lines on the ghost as well as a pumpkin. So I'm going to start with some brown paint and I'm going to go over all those little shadow lines and also around the pumpkin. Then I'm going to take that same brush, and I barely have any paint on here, and I'm just going in and doing some shadows, and then I took a little bit of black paint and filled in where the deepest shadows would be. Again, I barely have any paint on my brush while I'm doing this, and at this time I also filled in his eyes. Then I'm going to go in with some white acrylic paint and go over this entire ghost, and since this paint is thin, you're still going to be able to see where all those little shadows are going to be. Then I used some orange paint to fill in the pumpkin. I also used that same orange color mixed with a little bit of brown to do the flooring, and I just blended that up into the black background. Then I went over my ghost one more time with another layer of the white acrylic paint. Then while that layer is still wet, I was able to go back in where all those little shadows are and kind of blend those into where the flooring is and also into the ghost. For the larger birch piece, I wanted to do an outside scenery. So I'm first using some wet white acrylic paint to do a bunch of the background and just blending that with some black and mixing it with the white and kind of making a grayish nighttime sky. So I just continued blending that with that water until I was happy with the coloring. Then I'm going to dip that same wet brush into some black paint, and I'm just doing a couple little background bushes and trees by dabbing my paintbrush onto the birch wood. Then I'm taking a smaller brush and I'm dipping it into some dark red paint and just dabbing that all over the bottom of this to make the ground. I also mixed in a little bit of orange paint as well to make it look like fall leaves. Then I went back to my bigger brush and dipped it into some water. It still had the black paint and the white paint on it, and I just ran that brush over the ground part to blend that in. Then I mixed up a little bit of brown paint with a tiny little bit of black paint, and I'm gonna put a big tree in the foreground. Then it was time to add in my ghost, and I just did it a similar way that I did the first one, except for this time I started with the white paint instead of the shadows. Then I went into some black paint, added his eyes and then started doing the little creases and shadows for him. And once I had those all blended in, especially there at the bottom under him, then I go back in with my paintbrush that had the white paint on it and just blend that all in. And finally for this one, I just added in a couple little bats above the ghost. For this project, I have been dying to get my hands on this Home Goods Headless Horseman. Last year, I got the one with him on the horse. This year, I have not been able to find him. But while I was at Home Goods, I did see these little nutcrackers, and it gave me this great idea to use a nutcracker to turn into a Headless Horseman. So I thought about using one of my mini nutcrackers that I have from Christmas, but I ended up just getting this one on sale from Amazon to use for this project because I didn't want to have to go through my Christmas stuff. And this one's actually a really good size. He's about 15 inches and I got him for around $8. So of course I have to take all of his stuff off and I did have to cut his head off. So I just used my miter box saw for his little surgery, and then like I said, I removed all of his little stuff he had on, the cupcake, the sequins, and the little gingerbread man that was hanging from his hand. So once I had all that stuff removed and his head cut off, then it was time to turn him into the Headless Horseman. So I just used 2 coats of my black chalk paint and painted the entire nutcracker, and all those little tiny areas I just went back in once I had him completely painted and just used a smaller paintbrush to get inside where the little nutcracker piece is. Now, once he was completely dry, I wanted to dress him up just a little bit and give him a little bit of detail. So I'm just using this little mold that I got from Amazon, and I made 2 of these with some air dry clay and then attached them right to his chest piece with some gel super glue. Now, obviously, the Headless Horseman is gonna need a head, so I'm using this little pumpkin mold that I also got from Amazon and some more of my air dry clay. You can definitely just use a little tiny styrofoam pumpkin, wood pumpkin, but I already had this on hand and thought it would be a really neat jack-o'-lantern for him. So I just squished my 2 pieces in the 2 molds and then squished them together, but I'm also gonna gel super glue these together just to make sure that they stay. And then here I'm just using a little bit of water and my paintbrush to smooth out the cracks of the 2 pieces. Then if you remember, the nutcracker had a little hole in his hand where the cupcake was. So I'm just using a little stick and making a hole in the bottom of this, and I'll be able to use that to put on him later. Now I let all of my air dry clay pieces dry for a few hours, and then here I'm just going back in and painting over the pieces that I put on his chest with some black chalk paint. And for the jack-o'-lantern, I just mixed up a little bit of orange paint, and I'm gonna go over this entire thing with 2 coats. And then I decided to go in on the nutcracker and use this little sponge that came with my rub and buff, and I'm only doing the little clay pieces and his belt piece and then those little pieces above his boots. Of course, we couldn't finish him off without a cape, so I'm using just some black fabric that I got from Dollar Tree and a little piece of a cereal box. I just folded it over and used a glue stick to put it together just to make it a little sturdier and thicker. And then I rolled it down into the fabric a couple times and glued that to make a collar for the cape. Then I just wrapped that collar around and closed it with some of my Aleene's fabric glue. Then I just put some clamps on it to hold it for a little while that dried. And this fabric glue works really well, but I did end up deciding just to add a couple stitches with some black thread just to make sure that it would hold. I also wanted to make this cape look a little tethered and worn, so I just used some scissors and just started cutting a couple pieces out of it. Then to attach the cape, I just used some gel super glue right on the bottom of the collar and on the inside and attached it right to the top of him. I cut down a little piece of a small dowel rod from Dollar Tree and attached that with some gel super glue down into the hole of his hand. Then I just added a little more gel super glue so that I could attach the pumpkin onto the top of that. And finally, I just used a little bit of brown paint to paint the stem and do some shadows on the pumpkin, and used my paint marker to make the jack-o'-lantern face. For this next project, I picked up this little shadow box frame from my local thrift store. So of course, the first thing I needed to do was take everything apart, including taking out the smaller frame from the shadow box frame. Then to make these a little spooky, I am painting both of these little frames with 2 coats of my black chalk paint. Once they were both dry, I took some of my European Gold Rub and Buff and I just kind of went over the detail on the smaller frame. And then I also did a little bit of detail on the larger one. Then I just grabbed this little glittery spider that I got from the Dollar Tree last year, and I'm not worried about taking the glitter off. I just went over it with 2 coats of my black chalk paint and it covered up that glitter just fine. And then I decided to go over him with some of that Rub and Buff just to give him a bronzy gold look as well. For the backing of my smaller frame, I'm just going to use this little scrapbook paper that I got from Amazon, and I just used a glue stick to attach it to the backing that was already with the frame. Then I'm just going to grab a piece of Dollar Tree's black floral wire, and I cut that down and kind of bent it over and then hot glued it to the bottom side of the spider. Then for the top of the wire that is going to be pushed into the backing of the frame, I just grabbed one of these sewing push pins and kind of cut the end of it off, wrapped that floral wire around it, and then pushed it through the backing and then added some hot glue. I found this little mantel clock at my thrift store a while back and thought it would be perfect for a Halloween project. And I'm sure you all know how much I love clocks. So the first thing I did was paint this with 2 coats of my black chalk paint. Then I'm going to use some painter's tape to protect the top and the bottom and keep those black, because I'm going to take a wet sponge and sponge over this entire center part with some white acrylic paint. Now I realize it looks a little crazy right now as I'm doing this, but I'm going for a stucco look, and don't worry, I'm actually taking some black acrylic paint with a wet sponge and going back over this to kind of blend in that white. And you'll also see as I take the painter's tape off that I darkened the edges and corners to make it look really spooky. I let this dry completely before grabbing some of these shape stencils that I got from Amazon, and I'm going to use these shape stencils to do the doors and the windows on here to make it look like a haunted house. Now, if you can freehand this, by all means, but I just found it easier to use the shape stencils. So while I'm letting my door and my windows dry, I decided to add some creepy little vibes to one side of this. I traced out a spooky little tree with an owl sitting in it, and then just used some of my carbon paper to transfer this onto the clock. trunk. To fill in this silhouette, I actually used one of my Sharpie markers to kind of go around the edges, and then I filled it all in with my paint marker. Now going back to the windows, I'm again using those stencils, just using the same ones that I had used before, and I mixed up a little bit of dark red and some dark yellow paint to make this dark deep orange color. I wanted to give the windows the illusion of a little bit of light, but not really stark light, so it's kind of just faintly there. And as I was doing this, I also traced around the edges with my Sharpie marker just to give them some more detail, and then I used one of my other stencils just to use as a line so that I could make the window panes. Then it was time to really spook up this haunted house. So I grabbed some rub-on transfers that I got from Dollar Tree last year, and I just started randomly placing some ghosts and some spiders, and I even added a little grave on one side of this. But I did notice my ghost transfers were looking a little washed out on this color, so I did go in with one of my paint pens and just kind of used the rub-on transfer and colored those in. And that's going to be it for today's spooky Halloween video. I hope you all enjoyed this. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.